Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining the webinar on design futures. We'll wait for a couple of minutes so that more people can join in. We will be taking all the questions in text right at the end of the webinar. So whatever questions you have, you can put it in right at the end of the webinar, towards the end, in the text box. And a lot of your questions will be answered throughout the webinar as we proceed. So I'd suggest we all wait till the end of the webinar to have all our questions. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Moses Call, Assistant Manager Marketing at QGlue, and I shall be introducing the webinar today. I welcome everybody to the webinar on design futures with your speakers, Dr. Girish Prabhu and Sudhir Desai. I'll introduce Dr. Girish Prabhu first. Girish has over 25 years of experience in user, business, design innovation, new product and business development, and product internationalization and localization. He is the designer in residence for QGlue and director, Srishti Labs and Dean, School of Design, Business and Technology, Srishti Institute. And he has previous experience in leading teams at Kodak, Intel, and Human Factors International Asia. During his stints in the corporate world, he was a key player in conceptualization 3 new businesses using human-centered innovation method and was in leadership teams for 2 of these businesses. Girish has published referred papers in international journals, holds 16 US patents, and is an invited speaker at both national and international conferences. Sudhir Desai comes with a broad and deep background in working with important initiatives such as the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium, for which he has been past co-chair and a member of the award team since 2012. He also volunteers with organizations such as CCT in Boston, providing consulting services to nonprofits. Currently, Sudhir is head of strategy, foresight, and innovation at Srishti Institute of Art, Design, and Technology in Bangalore. He also advises clients on strategic innovation and design. His specialties include systems innovation, strategic foresight, business model, and service innovation/design. Now to give you a brief introduction about QGlue. QGlue is the design and innovation venture of QAI. QGlue uses design and design-led thinking to help businesses build services that people love and impact the world. Using human-centered approach and robust methodology, QGlue equips people to solve wicked problems by helping them reach a solution that is not just right but also desirable. In the end, QGlue aims to evangelize design and innovation that makes the world better designed and improves the human condition. Now I'll give the reins to Girish and Sudhir to take forward the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Moses. And we are very happy to do this webinar. We decided to do it as more of a conversation. So let's see how it goes. Yeah. Just to give you a partial list of organizations that have attended QGlue's design thinking. So the slides give you some idea about what we have been doing with many different companies in India and around the world. So with that, let me get into today's webinar. The title is Designing for Alternative Futures, and we are going to cover what, why, and how. Yeah.
So, hi, this is Sudhir. Very glad to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the future side of our discussion today, and particularly how that relates to design. So, the question I guess in most people's minds in the audience today is, what is design futures? So, let's look at that. Now, Bruce Sterling is a famous author. He's one of the pioneers in this idea of design futures. This is the quote that is attributed to him. It says that design futures is an approach to design that speculates about new ideas through prototyping and storytelling. Now, those of you who are familiar with design have probably seen ideas that suggest that design finds new ideas, it does prototyping. So it's something that you've already recognized. There are terms here such as new ideas and storytelling, which futurists among you would recognize as something that future thinkers do. So what I'm going to try and do in my piece over here is to help you understand how some of these things, terms that are used by both future thinkers and designers, how they relate to each other. So very broadly, if I would want you to remember something, I would want you to first think of futures thinking as something that helps us to think broadly, deeply, and think further in time. So this is a quote over here that happened very recently. This whole slide is attributed to Sohail Inayatullah, who is a UNESCO chair for future studies. He's located in Australia. Now, one of the things that happened was a person that he works with in the health sector was recently asked, what advice she would give in terms of futures thinking, and she said that we should always start with futures thinking. So I have a slightly different interpretation, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Futures are all around us even today. So there's a famous quote that I'll just paraphrase that says, futures is around us, but it's just unevenly distributed, which basically means that there is something that is happening today, which is ultimately going to become our future. So the question is, why do we even need to think about the future in a systematic way? So if I were to go around the room and ask people what they think about the future, they most likely think about a single future that is somewhat similar to what they know today, except it is probably much larger in scale, or not very different though from what we know today. And that is where futures thinking begins, as defining that as a problem. And the reason for that, which is paraphrased in point number one, the reason for that comes from with two fundamental issues. The first is that we believe that history, that how we arrived to where we are today, is some kind of a linear connection, a straight line connection between events. And that's one of the basic mistakes we make, because we know, most of us know, that history is contingent. A lot of things can happen that change the way, the course of history, and therefore, in a nutshell, history is a non-linear development, right? So that is one way of explaining where we are today. The other aspect of history is that there are many versions of history. We tell stories that explain how we came about to where we are today. Now, if that is true of the past, if that is true of how we came where we are, it's obvious that the future is also non-linear, and there are many possible pathways and there are many possible futures. So the first point over here, and I won't read the whole text, but one of the things that futures thinking does, it says, look at things broadly, look at reality in a much broader sense, and understand the fact that just as much as history is nonlinear, the future also there can be many futures. The second thing about futures is that we look at, in futures thinking, one of the core practices in futures thinking is systems thinking. And what that means is that we have to understand why is the system the way it is. And particularly when we are dealing with complex systems, what happens is that what we see on the surface is not really the reason why the system behaves the way it does. So as we dig deeper, we realize that what actually shapes the way the system behaves is things like worldviews and beliefs and values and stuff like that. And so it's important for us to understand, if we are going to look at alternate futures, we must also understand that we have to question the worldviews, we have to question our beliefs and stuff like that. So this deeper understanding of systems is a second aspect of futures thinking. The third thing about futures thinking is that, as I said, look farther out. And what that really means is that if we look very closely to where we are today, just maybe next year or 2 years or 3 years from now, things might look very similar to what they are today. And so you're not likely to see disruptions, we're not likely to see discontinuities or radical changes. Now, in our own experience, we probably look back 10 years and look at the technologies that we are using today, we'll realize that that's not true, right? There have been significant amount of disruptions. So these 3 points are probably the pillars of futures thinking. And so one of the things is that most futures practitioners come at it in very different ways, but the school of thought that we come from and where Sohail comes from, who's quoted here, is that we believe in action, we believe in the possibility of actually shaping the future and not just sitting and watching it happen. Futures thinking, just this is a very, very brief history. We've been, as mankind, we've been thinking about the future for a very long time. We know about astrologers, we know about all the shamans and everybody who's tried to understand what the future might be like. However, in recent time, this formal body of knowledge that we call futures thinking, the first thing originates after the war, right? It was at the time of the war that a systematic effort was put in place to try to understand what the future might be so that we could plan better from a defense perspective. And you will hear futurists talk about possible futures, which is very speculative, which says that anything that could possibly happen. So you can, when you look at popular futurists today, you see them talking about, with AI and with machine intelligence, this could happen and we could have robots taking over human lives. Those are kind of possible futures. But what futurists tend to do is to take from the possible futures those that seem more probable, and coming from the whole subsequent development of the peace movement, we are not just looking at probable and possible futures, but we're also looking at what is preferable and what does humanity really want. And so there are basically 2 big strands. One is systems thinking, it comes from the whole analytical perspective that says, if we can analyze and model it, we can understand what the future will be. And the second one comes more from peace building efforts and more community driven and much more conversational and much more depending on helping people to figure out what it is that they would like to see as their future. So what happens is that futures, there's one way of thinking about them, is to think that whatever is happening today will eventually decline or phase out. So you can imagine yourself seeing a horizon that we are in today, a perspective that will diminish and ultimately be replaced by another paradigm, another world, which we can say is the emergent future. Now we are always in between these things. We are present in a horizon, we are present in a paradigm that is declining, and at the same time, other paradigms are evolving. And we always find ourselves also in a transition between these 2 paradigms, between what is declining and what is emerging. So as a designer, one is always challenged to straddle these 2 worlds, the one that is declining and the one in which we find ourselves on a day-to-day basis, and the one that's emerging. And I think what this talk today and what Design Futures is all about is to say, how do we understand this emerging horizon, this emerging paradigm, which design does not have the methods to understand, but futures thinking does. And how can we take that and apply it to what we do today in terms of design? So this is very interesting because this is March, that is this month's publication in Harvard Business Review. And it says that many high profile companies that try digital transformations, they fail. And so you have a very illustrious list of companies over here, such as GE, Lego, Nike, P&G, Sears, Ford, name it, right? And these are some very large companies. And when they looked at the question of, like, why is it that these companies and their digital transformation efforts fail? One of the things, and the article has many more factors listed in it, but one of the things that they fail to anticipate is to anticipate where technology is actually headed, and not just where technology is headed, but where their businesses are headed. So as a result, what happens is not having, jumping into this whole technology thing and saying leading with radical technological change, but not understanding how it might evolve and what the future might be, is one of the factors that causes them to fail. So therefore, why? So Girish, you've been doing design for a while, right? And so I talked to you about how futurists tend to think about these issues. Do you think any of these things is relevant to what designers do, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have been doing design and design innovations since my graduation in 1994. And one of the things that was interesting, I started thinking about design futures after I met you at Srishti. And what I would like to take few steps back and take you through this journey about where things are going and how innovation is happening, and then start looking at what I feel as a design innovator do we lack in a design thinking method. And it's not that design thinking is not a very good method. It is just that, I mean, design futures or futuristic thinking can make it even better. And so with that, most of you know this, 75% of new products and services used to fail. I say used to fail because the data shows that it has improved. But in many cases, people who don't use design thinking, they are still stuck at this number of 75 to 80% of their products and services fail. And part of the reason is most of our innovation has been business and technology oriented. Both of them have equal space or equal responsibility at the table. And what you look at is something possible, is something manufacturable. It's the feasibility part of it. And if I can sell it to people, if there is a go-to-market ecosystem, then I have a business and product idea. And over time, it was realized that there is a third circle that is missing out of these two circles, and that was about usage and design, where you understand what the user value is. Am I doing something that is useful, usable, and desirable? And these three values of desirable, feasible, and viable was what started creating some successful products. And I have used this three circle model, thanks to IDEO, into most of my approaches that I have used in industry as well as after coming to Srishti. And it is known in many different terms. Some call it human-centered approach, some call it design thinking. But the major thing here is it's based on usage and design or empathy for the person that you're developing or the stakeholders that you're developing this product for. This particular approach is based on human values and human needs and motivations. And so rather than starting from systems and platforms that you want to design, this particular methodology looks at user needs, but to a certain extent, you can also look at bigger constructs like human values of happiness, togetherness, and spirituality. And from there, then it goes down towards figuring out what kind of systems and ingredients do we need to design. And this particular method has shown substantial impact or value. I've seen with my work at Kodak, we released multiple products using this thinking, very successful products. And one of the well talked about companies, Procter and Gamble. In 2000, at the start of 2000, only 15% of P&G's innovation efforts met profit and revenue targets. And when they put this design thinking based connect and develop, because their process was slightly more than just design thinking internally, they also started leveraging their ecosystem to do design thinking. By 2011, their success rate had shot up by 50%. And one of these papers, again, a Harvard Business Review, talks about how by 2017-18 they would have a six-fold increase in the output. Now, this is on product and services side, but we also see design thinking, this approach of human-centered design has made an impact on business strategy. Many stories there, but this is one which is very interesting and tickles me, is Indra Nui's story, where when she took up as a CEO of PepsiCo, nobody thought that she will survive. And she applied design thinking into business strategy, and she has been there 9 years strong and leading PepsiCo into new realms. But as you saw earlier, and we'll come to that, there are certain things that I feel are missing, because what this designing for human experience does is meets a person's emotions and attitudes. It covers aspects such as practical, experiential, affective, meaningful, and so on. However, it also places it at the same level as business and technology. And both business and technology are very quantitative fields which look at, if I build it, how many people will buy. And it doesn't necessarily, and it kind of puts human values at a slightly lower value system, because even if there is a value that says this should not be just used with in a business sense, we kind of try to neglect it, because eventually business and technology works. So few of the things that I see, Sudhir, lacking from a design thinking approach is many of our processes lack this being an early warning system. So an example here would be, it creates efficient, fast, and desirable experiences for users of products and services, but it doesn't act as a change agent or an early warning system. And few examples where, if you look at social media, or if you look at mobile phone usage, you sometimes look at it and say, have we created a beast? Was social media created to increase the number of suicides, or the number of mobile phones? Within 2 years, your mobile phones die, and with this new innovation all the time model, we come out with new products. And what happens is, we have created this capitalistic, individualistic behavior because of this model, which is based on business and technology. And then you look at trends such as what the effect of this. It's staggering that global debt has increased by 15 trillion, 57 trillion since 2007, outpacing the world GDP growth. And this is not about one country or the other. Across the board, if you look at it, all of us are in some sort of a debt. And you start then wondering whether the design thinking approach, does it allow me to think about alternative future of what it could be? You go look at e-waste generated by country, and that's increasing too. And we have now started thinking about what measures can we do to curb it, but something that is very alarming. So this is one thing that I see, that a typical design thinking approach that I have used, human-centered approach, hasn't allowed me to do this. And it's interesting that we do lots of trends analysis and to find out what's the competitors doing, where things are going. But very quickly we focus towards what can I deliver within the next year or so on, which doesn't necessarily think about alternative futures. The second thing that I feel that a shortcoming that I've seen is we get blindsided. We are committed to do something that we always do, and we don't think beyond that. So an example here is direct to home services. And this is a village in Africa where, and looks similar to what we would see in India. A person who has a very kacha house, a very small house, has taken DTH. And interestingly enough, if you look at the reports, DTH connectivity has grown in rural areas from 6% to 29%. At the same time, terrestrial connectivity has come down, which is very interesting. But most of the reason why this connectivity has been pushed to people is because of entertainment. In my own research, when I've gone to Indian villages, I have talking to the villagers and some of the people who are in this kind of conditions, as well as people in slums in urban areas, kind of making a comment saying that I don't know whether I will ever see prosperity, but let me at least die entertained. And that's nothing wrong in that. But and doing so, are we blindsided, saying that when this technology is there, why haven't we looked at the unmet demand of seeking programming connected to career advice, employment news, and skill development, so that something that can bring them to a better future. And this is something that I always feel that we fail to understand. The third thing is lack of new possibilities and opportunities. And here I will look at this story, and I put this story in front of my students, the students who come and want to do design-led innovation at Srishti. Story of Nano. Nano was a failure in certain ways, and a lot of people who have talked about it, they have talked about it as it's a emotional challenge as well as functional challenge. Yes, it was a fantastic human-centered design because the study was done based on pain points, aspirations, and gaps that people have who are going on two-wheelers, carrying four in their family, and coming out with something that can meet their needs, which is desirable. But and then I have feasibility. I can create actually a car like that, and I can sell it at a particular business model through a business model. This car was designed, and the failures happened of engine going on fire and all that stuff, but those have been fixed. But my question here is design thinking doesn't approach this from, is this the right problem to solve? It's a right problem to solve, but is this the right solution? And wouldn't it be better if people who designed nanos and suddenly increase the number of cars on the road, wouldn't it have been better to say, how do you wean people off car by rebranding bikes and buses? And you see this in Netherlands and Amsterdam, especially in Amsterdam. They have built highways for cycles, and it promotes cycling behavior than car behaviors. So this is again something that I'm again discussing with you early over these years at Srishti have started making me think that design thinking with design futures or futures thinking could help us. And last but not least, the risk mitigation to reduce adverse effect, because there are certain things that are important as human beings, as designers, that we have to look at, and we need to reframe what user experience means to have better understanding of social problems, marginalized users, future consequences, and in turn focus on human values and better present and future for all. So one of the things that we talk about at Srishti is responsible creative design, where the three circles still remain: usage design, business, and engineering. But business and engineering gets a smaller place at the table, and responsibility comes in, saying that, okay, what is the impact? What is the social good that I'm creating? This is no way in saying that this is social innovation. This is innovation for people, but thinking about responsibility as an extremely important factor. And I show business and engineering slightly as a smaller circle, not to diminish their value, but just saying that you cannot think about these two in the same way as you think about responsibility and usage and design. This also then tells us that we need to have socially responsible business models, and moving away from Maslow's pyramid to maybe Max Manfred's human development index, and also thinking about models such as permaculture. This is something that we did at Srishti Labs to look at how do I bring rickshaw drivers and rickshaws, which is one of the major transportation link in Indian market. And there are three factors here. One is obviously care for people and care for context that we do in design thinking. But one of the things that we may also want to look at is what is called as fair share. And how do I then think about business models, not just from a top line and bottom line perspective, but also thinking about whoever is included in this business to eventually be benefited. And that means my stakeholders as well as my end users. I think about them from a fair share perspective. So these are the things that I feel lacking in thing. And then I feel that design futures or a futuristic thinking methodology can help us to make design thinking better.
This is very interesting, Girish, because you're using a lot of the language that futurists use. So futurists normally talk about issues such as surprises. Because, as I said earlier, the assumption is that the future is non-linear. The evolution of our world is non-linear. And non-linearity means a couple of things, but one of which is very important to futurists, is the idea of discontinuity. Is the idea that what we are seeing today may not be there tomorrow. We might see something very radically different. So that idea of discontinuity and the increasing complexity and the number of different trends, a number of different forces that act on our world, that results in a very complex future, which is why we talk about being blindsided. We talk about the risk that our world will be disrupted, possibly disrupted. And the underlying idea in a lot of futures thinking today is that after we've understood what the possible risks are and what the likely discontinuities are, where we could possibly be blindsided, we become a little more savvy. Now, I'll just tell you a little story before I get into the how to do design futures. A lot of what we'll be talking about shortly, called scenario thinking, originated in shell oil. And one of the issues that shell oil had was that it was exploring the oil drilling in the North Sea. Now, when you know something, what we know about oil exploration in the North Sea is that it takes several hundreds of millions of dollars, and it takes almost 10 years to 20 years before an oil field can be developed and it becomes productive. So the question is that you make certain assumptions about the price of oil that help you justify the venture. However, you don't know that 10 years or 15 years, the assumption is that the oil price will continue to rise, and therefore 10 years from now, when your well becomes productive, the oil price will be at a certain level, and therefore you will recover your investments. And so happens that at that time, and Shell was very fortunate, that Shell asked the question, what if the oil price were to fall? What if that there are other new sources of oil? And then the OPEC crisis, and this is a well understood story, the OPEC crisis happened, oil prices fell, and so on and so forth. So these are the questions that this thing happens. So how do we do design futures? And let's look at that, right? So futures thinking looks at socio-technical perspectives and looks at one of the powerful methodologies is that if we can help people to see the future, if we can help them imagine the future in terms of concrete images, then it becomes possible for people to understand what the future might be. And therefore, the other thing is that we might also look at future studies as a way to bring change in society, and to bring, draw, and these perspectives and these images of the future, we can bring them into design. There are several well-known methods. This is not all the methods that are used in futures thinking, but these are some that are relevant to design thinking. Horizon scanning is one. Essentially, it's a way of trend tracking, except the kind of trends that you're tracking are somewhat different than you might normally be doing in design. We look at a little broader. We're looking for weak signals. We're looking at early emerging trends and things like that. We look at forecasting. Now, forecasting is generally frowned upon, but it is one method that is used, because forecasting typically is used in planning and business planning, and it projects a single future. But it is important to understand what is our expected future. So that is one method that we use. Backcasting is something that we do, which says, once we've imagined something, can we trace a line back to where we are today, and so that we can construct a narrative as to how a certain future can come about. And trends, of course, I talked about it in the context of horizon scanning. So essentially, I talked about the three horizons earlier. So this is horizon one, is typically the horizon that we are in, and that's the one that is declining. The green line shows you the horizon that is emerging, and that might eventually become the future. And the blue line is where we are transitioning, and this is happening all the time. We are transitioning from what is happening in horizon one to what will eventually become horizon three. So the question is that there are certain points, significant points, where our world shifts from one horizon or one paradigm into another, and that's what we typically call disruption. So one of the challenges that that happens is when we talk about alternate futures and we talk about distinctively different futures, which might be radically different from what they are today, it becomes very difficult to convince people and to help people understand that these possibilities exist. And so what futures thinking doesn't do a very good job of is it can speculate, but it doesn't know how to materialize and make those things tangible. Now, this is something that you guys in design are very good at, which is the materialization of the speculative. So this is where the two things come together, and design helps futures thinking. So you see on this chart that there are many techniques, that some of which are common, right? So design does trends analysis, so does futures thinking, except that the scope is somewhat different. We also do creativity, mind mapping, starting to speculate about things, trying to build relationships between data. And one of the important things we use in futures thinking is the ability to construct stories and to be able to tell stories about the future, and what we also call scenarios. So scenarios are one thing that could possibly be something that both futures thinking and design thinking can benefit from. So the slight differences: futures thinking tends to think in terms of systems, tends to think in terms of slightly larger scales, is essentially interested in alternative futures, and the way it communicates those are through storytelling. So the exploratory aspect and the idea of broadening and going deeper and going farther, that is the nutshell of what future studies does. Design thinking is somewhat more convergent, somewhat more focused on the immediate and the pragmatic, and so it's looking at the micro scale, it's looking at feasible alternatives, it's looking at solutions, right? So it's much more convergent rather than the divergent practice of futures thinking. And scenarios could be something that kind of bridges these two things. So if we appropriately use scenario thinking and the methodology in design, we could see how we could use that method to help us understand how the world will be, and therefore what will happen if this scenario were to come about, how is this scenario relevant, and how can we implement this vision, which is typically what design is concerned with. So scenario-based design is therefore, I'm not going to read all this text over here, but essentially the idea is that if we can use scenarios, which is speculative, which is somewhat, looking at alternative ways the future can be, then one of the questions that designers are interested in is, design comes at this thing from three different perspectives. One is like, if the future is going to be different, if your scenarios present a very different world, would our methods work, or do we need to change the methods? The second thing is, we have designed something today, would that design work in a very different world, in a very different scenario? And third thing is, if certain scenarios of the future might come about, what should we be designing? And those are the kind of questions that we can answer through scenario-based design. And as I said earlier, that what has been found is that when we ask people to shape their future, to imagine something that they can actually make happen, it is very helpful to create images. And that image literacy helps people to imagine a future that is preferred. So we talked earlier about preferred futures, and therefore imagining a preferred future and giving it an image, and therefore this whole idea of image literacy is extremely helpful in constructing scenarios.
And it's kind of interesting, Sudhir, that what I found out is, when you talk to me about this, we have told them that daydreaming is bad. And now, after meeting with you, I started realizing daydreaming will give us alternative futures, and which is very interesting.
So the couple of the things that you might have heard about is that this notion of trying to make the future tangible is extremely important, because if the future is very different, and if there are future of many alternative futures, one of the challenges people face, and the people that we are talking to and the people we are trying to help, they face, is that they are not able to visualize, they are not able to see the relevance. So if we can make it tangible through objects, which is what design fiction tries to do, which is creating these kind of prototypes that are very real objects. I mean, very objects that will help you to suspend your belief, right? And so you can imagine how something might work in a scenario that is somewhat familiar to you, right? So these are various techniques that I use that help you to bring these kind of radically different alternate futures and make them somewhat more comprehensible.
So as in, there are many of these kind of videos available, but what we wanted to show you is an example of what Corning did to show what future of glass would be. So let's look at this video. Looks like there is a bandwidth issue, I'm not sure. Yeah, we'll just stop here, and that gives you a perspective on how these type of things, cases, are put together.
Right. So one of the things. So this is a typical design fiction idea. One of the things you'll notice, this was done a few years ago, so this is probably already changing. But one of the things you'll notice over here is that Corning asked the question that we are in the business of glass, but exactly where will our product be in a future, in the future, right? And as they started imagining what role glass could play in a future, you'll see, for example, that they looked at various trends that are happening. And one of the trends that is happening is that, the world is becoming much or more, pervasive information, right? So anywhere you go, information exists around you, whether you're in the bathroom or in the car or on the streets. So the question is, what role? So knowing that this is possible, knowing the fact, for example, that ubiquitous connectivity is something that is likely to happen, the question Corning says is, okay, if that is true, if there is ubiquitous connectivity, if there's information everywhere, if information will become a dominant part of life, how will it manifest in the way people live, right? Whether they're eating breakfast or whether they're sleeping or whether they are, in their car. And as you can see, now, if you were to just tell people that, yes, this is how it'll be, it would be very hard to imagine a future like this, right? This future hasn't yet completely happened. But then by developing something like this, it becomes possible for you to create a fictional scenario, which is very familiar. You know all about, waking up and eating breakfast and going to work, except that it also shows you a futuristic product. Now, one of the things, therefore, is like the question is, how do we use these things? Now, as designers, you're very familiar with very concrete things. Futures thinking is more interested in creating a dialogue because, as you said, these alternative futures, they don't exist today. So the question is, if you open up your mind and if you see all these possibilities, how does that become a part of your action? What do you do with it? Now, you remember we talked about the three horizons. So we talked about we are currently in horizon one. Horizon three is this future that could happen. What does one do in horizon two is the most critical question. Now, we typically talk in terms of horizon 2 minus and horizon 2 plus. Now, what happens that designers and innovators typically when they are working in horizon 2, and there are lots of projects going on in R&D, in the labs and stuff like that. But if you look at them carefully, they are all H2 minus in the sense that they're looking backwards. And what that means is that they are reinforcing an existing paradigm which we know is destined to die. And so, what futures thinking does, and somebody asked about case studies, and this is what we do in our work, is that what we say is after we've created these alternate worlds of the future, you start looking at the work that you're doing in your labs and the kind of innovation that you're doing and the kind of new ventures that you're doing, and say, are they oriented towards a future that is yet to happen? And will it help us to get there rather than find ourselves having done a lot of work that is facing backwards?
Yeah. So sorry about, I heard the video didn't stream properly. Uh, Thanks to the bandwidth. So I'm going to finish this presentation, this webinar with a couple of things about after Sudhir joined Shrishti, what we did was we started bringing futures and futuristic thinking into our design programs and all our master's programs across the board, whether it's human-centered design, design-led innovation, public space design, we do bring in futures thinking into it, and it has seen a substantial change in mindset for our students. At QGlue, we also decided that we will apply this along with design thinking and service design approach. And what we have done is we have created a lab called Service Design Lab, which we want to make it into a do tank rather than a think tank, which will actually, and this is what we thought is a very good, interesting way of bringing design and futures together, thinking as well as doing together. And the first project that we have looked at is future of HR. And I'm going to skip through this quickly. We come out with opportunity spaces, and we are working on it. So any of you are interested in joining us to explore what future of HR would be and future of work would be, do connect with us. Thank you. So we can take questions now. Yeah, the first question is Akshit Gupta says, can you give us 1 second? Yeah, can you give a case study which was successful after implementing design thinking or design futures, but on hindsight you believe things could have been better? That is more success that actually achieved out of design future process. In case of nano example, it is easy to say it failed on the hindsight.
Yeah, usually you're right. I mean, hindsight is the easiest, right? We can construct a story that explains how something failed. On the other hand, companies that are successful, typically what they do, those that practice futures thinking, by the way, systematically, because not every company practices these things. Now, one of the things that happens is that, any new venture takes a certain amount of time to conceive and to launch and to get to work and stuff like that, and it must exist and coexist. Yes, there are several design future frameworks. There's not like a single framework such as what IDEO has described for design. You're basically using, but for example, if you looked at scenarios, then there are well established methodologies for how to construct scenarios. So the question then becomes, having done scenarios using them in combination with something like a three horizons method, if we can create, like, here are some possible worlds that would emerge 5-10 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, then you can use, so the idea is that there isn't a single framework or something like that. There is a near futures framework. If you look up on the web, you'll find something called a near futures framework. That is a specific lab that has done something for its own sake, but there isn't like an industry standard thing. And by the way, anyway, design futures is an emerging thing. It is not yet completely matured. The conversations in design futures are very wide-ranging at the moment, and there is not like a convergence. But in general, we understand that we have to use futures thinking and help that to guide design.
Yeah. And Akshit, to answer your question about is there a case study, there are multiple case studies of design thinking, uh, of successful implications. However, design futures is a new paradigm where future thinking and design thinking has been brought together. You would see a lot of design fiction and tangible futures videos that have been put together, but I don't think that there is any case study to prove that by using this approach, actually it has made an impact.
Yeah, what you will find, for example, is not necessarily in the in the context of design thinking. So, for example, there's a colleague of mine, an erstwhile colleague of mine called Rene Rohrbeck. He's written extensively about the use of futures thinking in innovation. For example, he specializes in that. Now, if you were to look up, in fact, I didn't bring the thing. So, with Deutsche Telekom, for example, he introduced the idea of futures thinking, and futures thinking was used to actually come up with an innovation strategy. So that's one case study that's available that you can look at.
Yeah. There's a question from Piyush. Is DOF used for upcoming smart cities in India?
No, unfortunately, my whatever little exposure I've had with people who are involved in smart cities, one of the challenges with futures thinking is that, let's say, for example, the people who are involved with smart cities are looking at, first and foremost, they have made a certain assumption that technology-based cities are the right idea. It's not open to questioning. And the second thing is that you understand that it's a very complex thing, that there are a lot of stakeholders, and there are many stakeholders who want to see immediate results. So if you talk to them that we should look at, questioning the assumptions behind smart cities, you're not likely to get this thing. So, however, if you go abroad, even in the East, Malaysia, Singapore, and stuff like that, they use design thinking, they use futures thinking to inform city planning.
So then there is a question by, does MA in Technology and Change program at Srishti covers future thinking? Yes, I mean, most of our master's program do bring in futures thinking into it. And Sudhir is one of the hottest sought after faculty to go and do master classes. We don't do any program purely on futures thinking, but we bring futures thinking into design and kind of align our students to think beyond and think about responsible design and think about alternative futures. Then there is a question by Prasad Batake. Any example like Corning you have seen in India, Asia, and now is reaping some success? It goes back to Akshit's question about are there any case studies? I am not aware of any case studies which have shown that the design futures thing is.
See, here's the interesting thing, Girish. One of the foremost authorities, the foremost, most sought after resource for design fiction actually is an Indian based in Ahmedabad. And her name is Anab Jain, and she runs a company called Superflux. So if you talk about design fiction, there are people in India who have done world-class work. Now, the question you're asking, Prasad, is whether or not Indian companies have used futures thinking. I can only tell you one thing, that about a year and a half ago, I had conducted a survey of about 30 leading corporations in India. And unfortunately, the result that came out of that was not many people are practicing foresight in a formal way. And therefore, maybe we are in the early stages. We'll start seeing some of these ideas come into India pretty shortly.
Yeah, Lakshman has made a comment. Thank you, gentlemen, for this insight. What I like is social responsible business model. But in consulting industry, how can this be preached? Or any examples who all have adopted this?
Yeah, I think what has happened is that the services industry in particular is asking serious questions about these kind of issues, right? Socially responsible. So there are conversations right now, for example, that if robotics and if machine learning and AI and all that start displacing workers, are we responsible for what happens to the people who are displaced? And so the question then becomes, are there some companies, and there are many companies now, albeit not big names, but they've started thinking about these issues and say, like, therefore, how do we design, how do we use technology in a responsible way so that the impact of the displacement that happens is not significant.
Now, the question by Kranti is, if digital
So,
transformation is failing, what is different in case of Tesla?
Yeah, I don't know if Tesla is a case study for digital transformation. It's definitely a case study for innovation. So, and at the moment, for example, Tesla, is massively funded, and it's not yet a profitable venture in that sense. I mean, there are many. It is yet to prove itself where its product, where it becomes a sustainable business model. But in terms of leading edge innovation, yes. And if you ask the question, look at what Tesla is doing in space, particularly what Elon Musk, not Tesla, but what Elon Musk is doing in space. Now, that is the kind of futures thinking, because there what is happening is that he foresees, he has a vision that says that space and the possibility of humans living in space is a distinct possibility, and we should start doing something now in order to make that happen. So I'm not talking of Tesla, I'm talking of Elon Musk, and I'm talking of SpaceX, but you can see futures thinking working over there.
Thompson has a question: how does the theory of change fit in with design futures? Are they the same thing?
Probably. So here's what happens. Futures thinking is all about recognizing the implications of change and time variation, right? And we are talking about, particularly, like, we are living in turbulent environments, and we are talking about velocity, variety, variation. All of these things, all of these dimensions of change are happening. So futures thinking is very sensitive to systems change. This is the basic understanding. And when we bring that into design, it becomes the same thing. Is that what we are thinking of? There are two aspects of change that we have to think about. One is, what is this different future that is going to come about? And the second question is, how do we transition? So you've heard of transition design, perhaps. So that's one of the things that concerns itself with this notion of change and change making.
And it's important, because the thing is, if you look at change, and if you look at technology, business, human beings, and behaviors and social norms, each of them changes at a slightly different pace. Technology is the thing that changes really fast, and a lot of times human behavior, social norms, codes, and conducts don't necessarily change, and because of that we do see problems in the world. Simple things as etiquettes of using mobile technology. We have pool sharing by Uber, but people who are using pool share don't know that what the etiquettes of using a mobile phone are. There are other things which can be, that usage is not that drastic, but if you can think about theory of change, and theory of change is one of the areas that could be interesting to look at from design futures, because design futures are for people eventually. So you're looking at technology and saying that, okay, is this the right thing to do? And so theory of change does play a big role. Unaid has a question: how can observing current trends and forecasting about future technologies help us radically develop new ones? How do you create that disruptive idea using futures thinking?
Well, there is no magic formula. If there was one, everybody would be following it. But what happens is that, first and foremost, the deepening, broadening that we talked about, that brings a lot more things into your perspective than would otherwise be, right? So normally you tend to look in a very narrow perspective, look at the system in a very narrow way. Therefore, your horizons are not very broad. The broadening of horizons, the deepening of your understanding, bring to surface a number of new ideas that you can then work with.
Yeah. And then it's not just looking at future technologies. You have to look at future technologies as well as behaviors, and then understand what would be a disruptive idea. Because if your technology future is not aligned with two things, one is what human behavior would want to be, but also from a responsible design perspective is not something that you want to create. And this is what design futures allows you to do, because you are looking at alternative futures. It also allows you to look at, is the future that I'm creating is a preferred future? And if I don't do that, I may create a future without my knowledge that is detrimental to society and detrimental to human beings. I don't know how much more time we have. There are questions.
Unaid has one more question.
Yeah, Unaid
One more question.
No, that was the question. And then Thompson, you said, how can designers engage with governments to work on design futures?
Oh, this is a huge movement right now in Europe, but in particular, a lot of things. Europe is particularly ahead in terms of practicing design futures. So a lot of these things that you see coming out, they seem to be coming out of Europe, and uh, their governments over there are particularly starting to look at, for example, the future of healthcare, the future of education. They're starting to ask questions: what will education look like 20 years from now, and what do we have to do today in order to shape and create the people that we need 20 years from now? What will healthcare look? What do we have to do today in terms of what kind of technologies will be available, as well as what kind of diseases do we expect, and how will care be delivered? These are all questions that are not obvious.
Yeah, and then one of the things, related to how designers can do this is moving our focus from just saying, okay, we are going to come out with cool designs, to also start thinking about strategies and bringing that perspective in, and hopefully then slowly it will allow us to get engaged. And as Sudhir said earlier, currently it is not happening, but it is one step at a time, one brick at a time, that you build this building.
Yeah, and when I say it's not happening so that we can say broadly everybody is practicing it.
Okay, and the final question is, how do we reach out to you guys? Both of us are on LinkedIn, and if you just Google us, you will find us. Our email IDs are, and I don't know how to, I'll put my email IDs as an answer here, so you can reach out to us through our emails. Either my email at Shrishti or at QGlue, and Sudhir's.
You have to send to all.
So I've sent our email IDs to all of you. So feel free to connect with us. Yeah. Any other questions or? Oh, Lakshman. Okay, can we consider scenario thinking could be the metric for futures thinking?
I'm not sure I understand what the question is, what you mean by metric, but it is one of the more popular techniques that is used in futures thinking. However, scenario thinking doesn't stand on its own. In order to do scenario thinking, you have to do trend analysis, you have to do scanning, you have to do backcasting. So all of those things kind of go together.
Yeah. And Prasad, for your question of how can design studios evangelize design futures, one way to do it is actually start that practice in your studio. Like companies put some R&D budget. Rather, clients are not going to come to you. Very few will come to you to say, okay, can you do design futures for me? And that is one of the reasons at QGlue we said, okay, let's start an activity on future of HR, because looking at what QGlue does, and the clients that QGlue works with, we said future of work and future of HR is an important area, and we started putting small efforts. Now, one of the things that could happen with that is like-minded people can come together, and then we'll say, okay, this is how we need to work together and figure out. Yeah. Is the HR project open to public? Can one track the progress online? Currently, it is not, because we are kind of dipping in, but it will be made open soon, depending upon, and we are looking at different models of people to engage. Our partners, quality assurance international's partners, and also others who would participate. And as I said, I mean, it is not a design, it's not a think tank, it's a do tank. So there will be a lot of future scenarios as well as templates that we are planning to create. Would this presentation be shared with us participants? Anand question. Absolutely, I don't see why it can't be. So I'll ask Moses to see how this can be shared. Yeah.
The recorded link will reach all the people who has registered for this webinar.
Yeah. Prabhu Xavier has a question. How do design future help in bioscience and life science industries?
Oh, that's very interesting. That's a big thing, right? Right now, people are asking questions about what is the future of pharmaceuticals, for example. And so there's a lot of work going on in speculating with all the developments in biotechnologies like CRISPR and the genetic modifications and stuff like that. What will be so we have to ask specific questions. Like when you say bioscience, we are looking at it in the context, let's say, of healthcare or context, let's say, of a pharmaceutical industry, right? And so it is in that context we start asking questions, or we are starting to see developments, emerging trends where these things are starting to work. I mean, or genetic modification is starting to work, or CRISPR technologies is helping us to, jiggle up, make new kinds of configurations of genes possible. So then we start asking questions, saying that if this thing really becomes the normal, if this grows and becomes feasible and the costs come down, what would that mean to, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry or to the healthcare industry?
And that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the way things are progressing in bioscience and life sciences, whether it is genetical modifications and so on. Design futures thinking would also ask, is this a right future that we want to have? Because a lot of times technology starts thinking about what can be possible, but all the possibilities may not necessarily be a preferred possibility, and that is something that we need to be constantly thinking. And that's where the responsible design, alternative futures, the preferred futures versus probable and possible futures is very important. Yeah.
I think if there's one statement I can insert over there, Girish, is that we're talking about shaping our destiny.
Yeah.
And it's not about being passively watching a future that comes about, and that might be dystopian or that might be disruptive, but being aware there is a single soul, there's a sole purpose of this is to say, what is that thing that, like you said, preferred future? What is that preferred future? It could be very different from the kind of scenarios that we are painting. And we might say that we would really like to see something like this. And the question then becomes, how do we empower ourselves to shape it? What do we have to do to bring about that future that we want?
Yeah. So I think we have answered most of the questions. If you have missed anything, but do reach out to us. We would love to hear from you and look at possibilities for collaborating. Thank you, and signing out.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you, Girish.
Thanks much.